May 12, 1945, Southern Ohio. The cattle car jerked to a halt, metal wheels grinding against steel with a sound that split the morning air like a whip crack. Inside, 37 German women auxiliaries steadied themselves against the walls, their faces pale beneath weeks of grime and fear. They had crossed an ocean in the belly of a Liberty ship, been marched through processing stations where American guards counted them like inventory, and now, after 3 days sealed in a rail car with only bread and water, they had arrived somewhere they could not name. The doors rolled open with a metallic shriek. Sunlight flooded in after dimness. The women squinted, bracing for shouts, dogs, cruelty. Instead came a smell, warm and rich. Bacon frying. Greta Hoffman, 23, felt her knees buckle, gripping the frame and hailing, understanding in an instant everything she'd been told was false. Propaganda had been relentless. The Reich painted Americans as barbarians, torturers, monsters. Posters showed bloody hands. Radio promised starvation camps. The women auxiliaries absorbed it all. When collapse came, many preferred death to capture, carrying cyanide or whispering plans to provoke guards into shooting, rather than face imagined horrors awaiting. By May 1945, hundreds of thousands of Germans were in American custody, including thousands of women auxiliaries. The United States intended to honor the Geneva Convention for policy, not sentiment. For the women stepping off trains, policy was invisible. They saw orders, smelled food, and felt confusion complete and overwhelming. Camp Clinton, Ohio, spread across farmland with neat barracks, whitewashed walls, windows without bars, latrines with water, and a large mess hall. Barbed wire and towers stood, yet guards carried slung rifles. There was no mud, overcrowding, or stacked bodies. The contrast felt theatrical, cruelly unreal, like a stage set. Greta followed the column, cataloging details, boots shown. There was no shouting, no dogs, no malice. The Americans looked tired, bored, ordinary. Processing prisoners seemed routine. That ordinariness unsettled her more than brutality. If this was the enemy, then certainty itself had begun to erode under the weight of reality. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these untold chapters of history. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from this incredible community of history enthusiasts around the world. Inside the mess hall, bacon sizzled beside fresh bread. Women froze, trembling. Trays held white bread, potatoes, 3 glistening strips. Months of turnip soup and sawdust bread echoed in memory. The contradiction felt violent. Some cried while chewing. Greta ate slowly, tasting salt and fat, forcing herself to remember everything. She thought of Klaus, her younger brother, 14 in Hamburg, scraping potato skins before the firestorm. The bacon turned to ash, yet she kept chewing. Across the hall, an American guard sipped coffee, watching without judgment. When he nodded apologetically, something inside her cracked beyond repair in that irreversible moment. Statistics later explained what bacon revealed. American industry dwarfed Germany's in oil, steel, weapons, and food. Abundance, not cruelty, marked defeat. Bacon was proof the enemy thrived while German children starved. In that simple meal lay the war's verdict, delivered without bombs, bullets, or hatred, forever altering belief and identity. The days settled into a rhythm that felt almost obscene in its normalcy. Reveille at dawn. Roll call in the yard, where guards read names from clipboards without menace. Work assignments, light duties like laundry or gardening, tasks that felt more like choreography than labor. Meals 3 times a day, each one an affront to memory. Coffee, real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they had choked down in Germany. Bread soft enough to compress between fingers. Soup thick with vegetables and, occasionally, chunks of meat. At night, lying on straw mattresses that did not reek of mildew, the women whispered. Some clung to the belief that this was temporary, a softening before the hammer fell. Others, more pragmatic, began to adapt, their bodies betraying ideologies with each satisfied stomach. Greta said little. She spent her evenings staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the wood, replaying the moment the train doors had opened and that smell had rushed in. She could not reconcile the bacon with the propaganda. She could not reconcile the nod from the guard with the stories of American savagery. And so she existed in a kind of limbo, suspended between two incompatible truths. The psychological warfare was subtle but relentless. Within weeks, the Americans introduced education programs. A long hut was cleared and fitted with benches and a chalkboard. Books appeared, crates of them, in English and German. Novels, histories, even poetry. For women who had watched the Reich burn books in public squares, who had lived under a regime that dictated what could be read and thought, the sudden availability of uncensored literature was dizzying. Some refused to enter the classroom, viewing it as contamination. Others, driven by a hunger deeper than physical need, devoured the pages. An American sergeant named Williams taught English. He was patient, almost fatherly, his pronunciation exaggerated as he coaxed them through basic phrases. "Good morning." "How are you? My name is—" Greta repeated the words mechanically, her accent thick, her resentment thicker. But the words lodged in her brain like seeds. At night she found herself whispering them, testing their weight. She hated that they came easily. She hated more that she wanted to learn. The films were harder. One afternoon, the women were assembled in the mess hall, where a projector flickered to life. Footage from Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Skeletal figures behind wire. Corpses stacked like firewood. Ovens. The room went silent except for the rattle of the projector. Greta felt bile rise in her throat. Some women turned away. Others wept. A few shouted denials, their voices shrill with desperation. The Americans said nothing. They simply let the images speak, let the truth sit in the room like a third rail, electrifying and inescapable. Greta had known, in the abstract, that camps existed. Everyone had known. But knowing and seeing were different countries, separated by an ocean of willful ignorance. The footage stripped away that distance. She thought of the bacon, the bread, the coffee. She thought of the children in Hamburg. And she thought, for the first time, that perhaps the greatest crime was not what had been done to the enemy, but what had been done in her name. The newspapers came next. Camp newsletters written in German, filled with articles about democracy, individual rights, the rule of law. The words felt alien, almost seditious. Greta read them in secret, folding the pages small and tucking them into her jacket. She did not believe everything, but she could not unread it. The ideas once planted grew like weeds, choking out the certainties she had carried since childhood. One evening, Williams asked them to write about their lives before the war, in English if possible, German if not. Greta bent over her paper, the pencil awkward in her hand. She wrote about her father, a school teacher who had joined the party not out of belief but out of necessity. She wrote about her mother, who had died coughing blood in the winter of 1943. She wrote about Klaus, about the firestorm, about the smell of burning flesh that had clung to her clothes for weeks. When Williams read her essay aloud, his voice halting over her German script, she felt something crack inside her chest. The Americans were not mocking her pain. They were bearing witness to it. Humor flickered at the edges of camp life, unexpected and unsettling. During one English lesson, Williams tried to teach the word bacon by writing it in large letters on the board. The room erupted in laughter, women doubling over, shoulders shaking, the absurdity too much to contain. Williams grinned, his chalk-dusted hands raised in mock surrender, and for a few moments the war dissolved. Greta laughed until tears came, and she could not tell if they were born from amusement or grief. But the tension never fully vanished. Every meal was a reminder of the disparity. Every lesson was a challenge to everything they had believed. Greta found herself caught between loyalty to the dead and the undeniable evidence of her own senses. She had been taught that Americans were monsters, yet the monsters fed her. She had been promised cruelty, yet the guards spoke softly, almost apologetically. The contradiction gnawed at her, a slow erosion of certainty that left her hollowed out and raw. By the end of summer, the camp had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Some women hardened, retreating into silence and refusal, their pride the last fortress against collapse. Others softened, cautiously, learning English with surprising fluency, borrowing books from the library, even joking with guards. Greta existed between these poles, wavering, unable to commit to either defiance or acceptance. She read Huckleberry Finn and found herself charmed by the boy's reckless freedom. She had listened to jazz drifting from the guards' quarters and felt something stir in her chest, something almost like longing. One night, unable to sleep, she walked to the perimeter fence. The stars were sharp and cold, indifferent to human suffering. She thought about the bacon, about the books, about the films. She thought about Klaus, about her mother, about all the people who had died believing in a lie. And she realized, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that the war had not ended when the guns fell silent. It had only changed shape. The real battle was not for territory or resources, but for belief. And in that battle, bacon was a more potent weapon than any bomb. The gates opened in November. The war was over, the paperwork processed, the women cleared for repatriation. Greta stood in line with the others, clutching a small bundle. Inside were clothes, a notebook filled with English phrases, and a battered copy of Huckleberry Finn that Williams had given her. She did not know if she would ever open it again, but she could not leave it behind. The train that carried them back across the Atlantic was crowded and cold. Germany, when they finally arrived, was unrecognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, refugees clogging the roads, children with hollow eyes begging for scraps. Greta stepped onto the platform in Hamburg and felt the ground tilt beneath her. This was freedom, this was home, and it was more terrible than captivity had ever been. She found what remained of her street. The apartment building where she had grown up was gone, replaced by a crater filled with rainwater and debris. A neighbor, gaunt and gray, told her Klaus had never come home. Her father had died at Stalingrad. Her mother crushed beneath rubble during an air raid. The words landed without ceremony, stripping her bare. She stood in the rain, her bundle clutched to her chest, and felt the weight of survival settle on her shoulders like a stone. The weeks that followed were a strange purgatory. She stayed with distant relatives who eyed her with suspicion. She had been fed. She had gained weight. Her cheeks carried color while theirs were sunken. One cousin asked, voice sharp with accusation, what she had given the Americans in return. Greta could not answer. How could she explain that survival had been offered without barter, that the enemy had fed her not out of kindness, but out of policy, and that policy had been more humane than anything she had known in the Reich? On the streets she heard whispers about returnees, collaborators, traitors, women who had grown soft in captivity, while real Germans suffered. Children stared at her, their eyes accusing, their bellies swollen with hunger. She stopped looking at them. Each glance was a knife, each hungry face a reminder of the bacon she had eaten, the bread she had wasted, the coffee she had poured down the drain because it had gone cold. At night she lay awake, listening to her relatives shift restlessly in the next room. She wondered if they resented her, if they wished she had died with the others. She wondered if she wished it too. But in the darkness the lessons returned, the chalkboard words, the films, the books, the jazz. The Americans had not broken her with cruelty. They had unsettled her with possibility. And that possibility, once glimpsed, could not be forgotten. She began to write again, filling her notebook with clumsy English sentences. She wrote about Klaus, about her mother, about the smell of bacon and the taste of shame. Her relatives caught her once, frowning at the foreign words. "Why waste ink on their language?" they demanded. She did not answer, but she knew, because the language connected her to a world that had not been reduced to ash, because the words carried the promise that something could be rebuilt, because in the wreckage of everything she had believed, those phrases were the only foundation that felt solid. Months passed. American aid trucks arrived, distributing tins of food to the starving. Greta stood in line with the others, watching as soldiers handed out rations. When a tin was pressed into her hands, she stared at the label. American. The irony was too sharp to bear. The enemy had fed her once in captivity. Now they fed her again in defeat. The pattern could not be ignored. She carried the tin home, and her relatives opened it with trembling hands, praising the Americans' generosity. She said nothing, but inside something shifted. The war was over, yet the enemy still reached across the ocean with open hands. One evening she returned to the ruins of her street. The sun bled red across the broken city, casting long shadows over brick and bone. She sat on a piece of rubble, opened her notebook, and wrote a single sentence in English. "I am still alive." The words looked fragile on the page, but they felt stronger than any uniform she had worn. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, letting the silence settle. The taste of bacon had never left her. It lingered not as memory alone, but as symbol. It was proof that the world was larger and stranger than propaganda had allowed. It was evidence that enemies could be more complex than caricatures. It was a reminder that humanity, even in war, could manifest in unexpected ways. The Americans had not offered forgiveness. They had not asked for gratitude. They had simply acted according to principles she was only beginning to understand. And in that acting they had waged a war more devastating than any blitzkrieg. A war for her mind. She rose, tucking the notebook under her arm, and walked slowly through the ruins. Around her the city groaned with hunger and bitterness. But inside her something new was taking root. A fragile hope that perhaps from the ashes of ideology and empire something else could grow. She did not know what. She could not yet name it, but she carried it with her, hidden and tender, as she navigated the wreckage of the only world she had ever known. The smell of bacon, once so shocking, had become a touchstone, a scent that marked the boundary between one life and another, between the woman who had stepped off the train in May and the woman who walked these broken streets in November. She had survived captivity. She had survived repatriation. Now she would survive the harder war, the war for meaning, the war for memory, the war for a future not yet written. And as the last light faded over Hamburg, Greta Hoffmann clutched her notebook and whispered into the cold air. Not a prayer, not a curse, just a statement of defiant, terrifying, irrevocable fact. She was still alive, and that, in the end, was the most dangerous truth of all.